Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com.
Hello, everyone. This is Bruce Venter. I'm a trustee of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, and I'm here today to interview an author of the book Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero, Christian Di Spigna. His book was published in 2019, and it has garnered many accolades over those few years that it's been out. Our podcast today is going to discuss the life of Dr. Warren, and then we'll have a follow-up podcast which will discuss the death of Dr. Warren. So, Christian, I'd like to start out with telling me why you wanted to write a book about Dr. Joseph Warren.
Yeah, well, so there have been, I think, only 2 full-length nonfiction biographies written on Warren when I started the research on my book. So, I mean, just to give you a comparison point, there's been at least over 1,000 biographies written on General Washington. So when I was a undergraduate at Columbia University, I'd come across a book a few years earlier, and I'd gone to my mentor and said, hey, I want to do my senior thesis on this guy, Dr. Joseph Warren. And it was just incredible to me how he had accomplished so many things in his brief life. And that, you know, I can't really say he's forgotten anymore, but he's definitely underappreciated. And so really the mission of that senior thesis when I was undergraduate was to really sort of flesh out more about Warren's personal life, because the most recent biography at that time had been written in 1961. And it was more a look at his professional career. And so, you know, one of the challenges of the book was that, you know, there wasn't a lot of primary source information on Warren that was visible to scholars and historians to that point. So it took a couple of decades of digging and research, and I was able to flesh out a bunch of new discoveries and some really enlightening things that really kind of brought Warren back into the spotlight.
I understand that you actually physically moved to Williamsburg for your research. Is that true?
Well, it's partially true, because I had been coming down to Colonial Williamsburg so often to meet with the apothecary shop and a particular individual named Sharon Cotner, who was incredibly helpful to me, because when she first started pulling out these books and reference materials, everything looked like hieroglyphics. You know, some of the symbols that Warren would put in his medical ledgers. And so she was so helpful to me. And, you know, I would come down here and talk to the cobbler and the wig maker and, you know, the painting experts. And so I really fell in love with Colonial Williamsburg, and we had the opportunity to move down, and we did that in 2011.
Well, that's great. So let me ask you, too, I understand that you were able to ferret out descendants of Dr. Warren, and before your book, it was generally believed that he didn't have any descendants down to this present time period. Is that true?
It is true. And that was one of the frustrating things. And you know, every publication on Warren, whether it was a newspaper article, magazine, biography, they all claim that Warren's direct line had died out in the late 19th century. And I got very lucky. I was able to connect with the Warren family historian by the name of Captain George C. Wildrick, who was the family historian. And our first conversation lasted about 6 hours. And that's when the research for the book really blossomed, because he brought me to relatives' homes, and they started pulling out all kinds of family trees and material culture pieces, and it just gave us another keyhole into the private world of Dr. Joseph Warren, and most of these items had never been seen by the public before. So it was really it was almost like hitting the lottery when I connected with the direct descendants.
And I understand that during the course of your research, you also acquired some archival material, artifacts related to Dr. Warren. Could you tell us about those?
Yeah, so Warren has 2 medical ledgers that exist, and they're in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And the first one they possess is from 1763 to 1768, and the other book journal they have of Warren's is from 74 and 75. So we're missing the years of 69 to 73, which are, key years, obviously, the Tea Party, the massacre. And I think it was in 2007 or 2006, there was an auction, and they were auctioning off a piece of Warren's missing medical journal. And the great part about that piece was that he had listed one of his patients as the sixth victim of the Boston Massacre, Christopher Monk, who's usually never remembered as the sixth victim because he malingers and dies a decade after the event from his wounds. But it was such a cool piece because it came with a letter from 1865, I believe, by a gentleman named Ellis Ames, who's footnoted in the first Warren biography that was published by Richard Frothingham in 1865. And he references this Ellis Ames, saying he has all these pieces of Warren's medical journal that he's giving away as gifts. And we don't know how he came upon the journal, but in that letter with the auction from the piece of the medical ledger was this one-page letter describing about, Warren's lost medical journal and how he was in possession of it. And he just got into the habit of, he was a lawyer from Dedham, Massachusetts, and he was also a big collector of ephemera and material culture pieces. So it was just, for me, it was the find of a lifetime because it not only proved the existence of these missing ledgers, but it also had some really historically important information listed on that ledger piece.
That's really terrific. We all know that Thomas Jefferson was basically the author of the Declaration of Independence, but it's my understanding that Dr. Warren was involved with a document called the Suffolk Resolves that could be considered the forerunner of the Declaration. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so obviously, British Parliament is punishing the town of Boston for the Boston Tea Party, and so what happens is they close the port of Boston, which is one of the acts of the Intolerable Acts, and so Warren writes this seminal document called the Suffolk Resolves, and it's basically a declaration of rights and grievances that's calling for the colonists to arm themselves and prepare themselves in the art of war immediately. And so what's really so important about this document is that Warren dispatches Paul Revere on his first lesser famous ride, and he goes to Philadelphia and presents the document to the First Continental Congress that's meeting in Philadelphia in September of 1774. And we all know that this was a sort of a bitter atmosphere filled with discord from all the different delegates from all the different colonies. And what happens is they read this document that Paul Revere delivers and they adopt it unanimously, which is a huge moment because obviously it creates this spirit of favor and less hostility. And so that's why when people kind of say, well, the founders didn't know who Dr. Joseph Warren was, I mean, it's nonsense because they all knew who he was just by this famous document that we call the Suffolk Resolves.
How was he as a physician? What's your feeling about how he handled himself in his profession of being a doctor?
It's funny because when I wanted to first write about Warren, I wanted to write about Warren and medicine. But as you know, Bruce, medicine was so rudimentary at this time. Obviously, there's no medical schools in the colonies at this time. So when Warren graduates Harvard, he decides to do his apprenticeship with a gentleman by the name of Dr. James Lloyd, who's Warren's real first mentor. And Lloyd had apprenticed over in the glittering capitals of Europe. And so when he comes back to Boston, he brings back with him like the most up-to-date medical techniques, which is smallpox inoculations, obstetrical care. So Warren and Lloyd are actually kind of this, 1-2 punch of this medical community that are practicing like the most skillful techniques. And we know that Warren's doing all kinds of treatments. There's a quote in one of his journals saying that, he's reducing someone's shoulder, which is basically a dislocated shoulder, which would have taken a lot of skill back then. He's using things like blister pipes to give enemas. I mean, he's treating venereal diseases. He's delivering babies, so he's doing it all. And it's kind of a grisly sort of practice where he's dealing with some nasty things and some really beautiful things. So we know that his medical practice becomes one of the busiest in Boston, which is really a testament to his popularity and medical skill given at the time. That he's really, when he starts his practice, he's in his early 20s.
Who were his most famous patients?
I think that was one of the most telling things when you read Dr. Joseph Warren's existing medical ledgers. It gives you a look into his business, his practice. And so he's not just running a medical office, he's running an apothecary shop, he's making pills, he's selling quires of paper. But that was the great thing about his medical practice, is this is why you see him have a foot on each side of the political divide, because he's treating every rung of the social ladder, from slaves, indentured servants, farmers, merchants, all the way up to the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, and everything in between. So that's why Warren becomes such an important person, because both loyalists and patriots are trying to convert him over to their side, because he's such a person of merit and credit, and he's got an incredibly wide and deep network.
I think you've written the definitive work on Dr. Warren, and I think that it will stand for a good long time. Now, our next edition of Lake George Battlefield Moments is going to deal with the death of Dr. Warren, and that's an incredible story. So I hope everyone will tune in next time and hear Christian tell us more about Dr. Joseph Warren. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in for Lake George Battlefield Moments.